The morning sun had barely crested over the mountains when I heard them coming. 3 men in matching blue polos with HOA security division embroidered on the chest were creeping through the tall grass along my property line at Windstone Valley Estates. They moved like amateur ninjas if ninjas carried clipboards and wore khakis. I watched them from my kitchen window, coffee in hand, as they approached my fence line. What they didn't know was that I had installed motion-triggered sprinklers last week, and they were about to get a very cold wake-up call. The first one triggered the system at exactly 6:47 a.m., and the shriek that came out of that grown man's mouth could have shattered glass. The second one tried to dodge the water and ran straight into my electric fence, which was set to livestock mode. The third one, well, he was the unlucky one who met me at the gate, holding my grandfather's old hickory walking stick like I meant business. My name is Jake Sullivan, and I own a 12-acre ranch property within the boundaries of Windstone Valley Estates. When I bought this place 3 years ago, the realtor assured me that the HOA rules were minimal for ranch properties. Just basic stuff about keeping the place from becoming an eyesore. I should have read the fine print, or better yet, I should have met Karen Blackwood before signing those papers. Karen was the HOA president, a woman who treated the neighborhood, bylaws like they were handed down from Mount C itself. She had the kind of energy that made you wonder if she slept at night or just stayed up plotting new ways to measure grass height. Her husband Gerald worked at some accounting firm downtown, and rumor had it, he spent extra hours at the office just to avoid coming home to her latest crusade against improperly sorted recycling bins. It all started 6 months ago with a complaint about my rooster, a magnificent bird I called General Patton. According to Karen's carefully typed letter on official HOA letterhead, General Patton was crowing outside of approved AVN vocalization hours. I didn't even know that was a thing. The letter cited subsection 12(3)(6) of the community guidelines, which apparently stated that all domesticated fowl must observe quiet hours between 10 p.m. and 8 a.m. General Patton, being a rooster, didn't exactly come with a mute button. I wrote back explaining the biological impossibility of training a rooster to check his watch before crowing. Karen's response came within 24 hours, this time citing the unauthorized livestock clause and demanding I remove all farm animals from the property within 30 days. The letters kept coming, each one more ridiculous than the last. My American flag was too large and created what she called excessive patriotic display. My truck was parked at the wrong angle in my own driveway. The hand-painted sign at my gate that read, "Trespasser will be composted," was deemed threatening to the community aesthetic. I responded to each complaint with increasing levels of legal citations, pointing out that ranch properties were explicitly exempted from most residential restrictions, according to the original community charter from 1998. Karen didn't like being corrected. She really didn't like it when I started carbon copying my responses to every member of the HOA board and posting them on the community Facebook page. That's when she decided to escalate things. At the monthly HOA meeting, which I attended for the first time just to see her face when I walked in, she proposed a special assessment for ranch properties to fund additional compliance inspections. She claimed my property was bringing down home values and creating a public nuisance. I stood up during the public comment period and read directly from the State Agricultural Protection Act, which superseded any HOA authority over active agricultural operations. You could have heard a pin drop. Karen's face turned a shade of purple I'd only seen on exotic eggplants. She slammed her gavel so hard it broke, then declared the meeting adjourned, even though 3 other board members were trying to speak. The next morning, I found a notice taped to my gate declaring my property non-compliant with 17 different HOA regulations. The daily fine would be $500 per violation starting immediately. That was $8,500 per day. I laughed out loud, took a photo of the notice, and sent it to my lawyer, who happened to specialize in HOA disputes and agricultural law. He called me back within an hour, barely able to contain his excitement. Apparently, Karen had just handed us a slam dunk case for harassment. and violation of state agricultural protections. But Karen wasn't done. She hired what she called a security team. 3 men who all happened to be named Brad, though everyone called them the Brad Brigade. They parked a van at the edge of my property every morning, taking photos and videos of everything from my fence posts to my wheelbarrow. They even brought surveying equipment one day and tried to claim my fence was 6 and over the property line. I had my property surveyed the week I bought it, and my fence was actually 2 FT inside my boundary. When I showed them the official survey documents, they claimed they didn't recognize my surveyor's credentials. That's when I installed the cameras, 14 of them, covering every angle of my property line. The Brad Brigade started getting creative. They would blast music from their van at exactly 9 p.m., 1 hour before the noise ordinance kicked in. They left anonymous complaints with animal control about my goats, claiming they were malnourished. The animal control officer who came out ended up staying for coffee and bought 2 dozen eggs for my chickens before leaving. They even tried to claim my pond was a mosquito breeding ground and public health hazard. The county health inspector they dragged out took one look at my aerator system and fish population and told them to stop wasting his time. Then came the morning they decided to take matters into their own hands. Karen had somehow convinced herself that she had the authority to conduct an emergency compliance inspection. She drew up official-looking documents with lots of legal-sounding words and sent her Brad Brigade to execute what she called a lawful entry for community safety verification. The problem was nothing about it was lawful. They didn't have a court order, they didn't have permission from law enforcement. And they definitely didn't have my permission. But there they were at dawn, climbing over my fence with their clipboards and their misplaced confidence. The first Brad hit the sprinklers and started dancing like he was being attacked by invisible bees. The second Brad grabbed the fence to steady himself and discovered why you don't grab electric fences, even the ones set for chickens. His yelp probably woke up everyone within a mile radius. The third Brad, the one I now think of as the bravest or stupidest of the 3, made it to my gate where I was waiting. I told him once to get off my property. He held up his clipboard and started reading some nonsense about HOA emergency authority. I told him twice to leave, this time pointing my hickory stick toward the exit. He took a step forward, and that's when things got interesting. Now, I want to be clear about something. I didn't actually shatter anyone's shins, despite what Karen would later claim in her police report. What happened was Brad number 3 tried to push past me, tripped over his own feet while backing away from my very calm, defensive stance, and fell into my heritage rosebush. The thorns did more damage than I ever could have. He scrambled out of those roses like they were made of hot coals, his pants torn in 12 different places, yelling about assault and lawsuits. I just stood there, hickory sticks still pointed at the gate, and reminded him that my cameras caught everything, including him trespassing and attempting to force entry into my home. The other 2 Brads had to help him back to the van. One was soaking wet and shivering. The other was doing this weird jumping motion from the electric fence encounter, and the third looked like he'd wrestled with a very angry cat and lost. They drove off and I went back to my coffee, but I knew this wasn't over. I immediately called my lawyer and sent him all the camera footage. He told me to sit tight and let Karen make the next move. I didn't have to wait long. 2 hours later, 3 sheriff's deputies showed up at my gate. Karen was with them, standing by her white Lexus SUV, arms crossed and wearing what I can only describe as her victory face. The lead deputy, a guy I recognized from the local diner, looked embarrassed to be there. Karen had called 911 claiming I had taken hostages and was threatening HOA officials with deadly weapons. She actually used the words terrorist threat in her complaint. The deputy asked to see my security footage, which I happily provided on my tablet right there at the gate. We watched all 4 angles of the morning's events. The Brad Brigade climbing my fence, clearly marked with no trespassing signs every 10 FTT, the sprinkler activation, which the deputy actually chuckled at. The electric fence encounter, which got an actual laugh. And finally, Brad number 3 trying to push past me and falling into the roses entirely on his own. The deputy turned to Karen and asked if she had authorized these men to enter private property without a warrant. She started talking about HOA authority and community safety and her interpretation of easement rights. The deputy held up his hand and stopped her mid-sentence. What happened next was beautiful. The deputy explained to Karen slowly and clearly, like he was talking to a child, that HOA rules did not supersede criminal law. Trespassing was trespassing. Attempted breaking and entering was a felony. Filing a false police report was also a crime. He then turned to me and asked if I wanted to press charges. I said I'd be happy to let it go if the HOA dropped all fines and ceased any further harassment. Karen started screeching about her rights as HOA president and how she would have his badge for this. That's when the deputy decided he'd heard enough. He called for backup, not for me, but for Karen. 2 more units arrived, and they spent the next hour taking statements from the Brad Brigade, who had been sitting in their van down the street, apparently waiting for their triumphant return to Karen's good graces. Each Brad ended up admitting that Karen had told them they had legal authority to enter my property. They showed the deputies the documents Karen had prepared, which included forged county seals and fabricated statute numbers. One of the deputies recognized the forgery immediately because Karen had misspelled the county name on the seal. The investigation that followed was thorough and devastating for Karen. They subpoenaed the HOA records and found that she had been issuing fines without board approval, using HOA funds to pay the Brad Brigade under the table, and had created over 60 false compliance violations against various homeowners who had disagreed with her over the years. She had even submitted forged complaints using names of residents who had moved away years ago. The county prosecutor took one look at the evidence and filed charges for forgery, fraud, misuse of fiduciary funds, and criminal harassment. The emergency HOA board meeting that followed was standing room only. Gerald sat in the back row, his head in his hands as the board's lawyer explained the extent of Karen's actions and the potential liability to the association. The vote to remove her from the board was unanimous, even from her usual ally, Janet, from the landscaping committee. Karen stood up and tried to give a speech about conspiracy and persecution, but the lawyer informed her she was no longer recognized as a member and needed to sit down or leave. She chose to leave, slamming every door on her way out. The criminal. Trial was swift. Karen's lawyer tried to argue that she believed she was acting within her authority, but the forged documents killed that defense. The prosecutor showed email after email where Karen discussed taking down residents who challenged her, including detailed plans to financially ruin me through fraudulent fines. The jury deliberated for less than 2 hours, guilty on all counts. The judge, who seemed personally offended by the forgery of county documents, sentenced her to 18 months in prison, 3 years probation, and ordered her to pay $47,000 in restitution to the various homeowners she had targeted. When the judge read the sentence, Karen's mouth fell open like a broken gate. She turned to Gerald, who was already walking out of the courtroom, then to her lawyer, who was packing up his briefcase with obvious relief that this case was over. As the bailiff approached with handcuffs, she started screaming that this was a setup, that I had ruined her life, that the entire neighborhood would fall apart without her leadership. The judge added 30 days for contempt of court. The last image I have of Karen Blackwood is her being led away in handcuffs, still shouting about grass height violations and the proper method for storing garbage bins.